Once upon a time, these names were everywhere, on class lists, during roll call, and shouted across the playground. But now, they've almost disappeared. Today, we're remembering 20 forgotten Canadian names that used to be popular in every classroom, from kindergarten to high school graduation. Names are more than just words. They're time capsules, cultural markers, and intimate connections to our past. They reflect the hopes parents held for their children, the celebrities and heroes of their era, and the deep cultural currents that shaped entire generations. In Canada, a nation built on immigration, Indigenous heritage, British and French colonial influence, and waves of cultural transformation, names tell a particularly rich story. This journey will take us through a century of Canadian naming traditions, exploring 20 names that once filled school yearbooks from coast to coast to coast. We'll discover why these names rose to prominence, what they meant to the families who chose them, and why they faded from modern birth certificates. Along the way, we'll uncover forgotten stories of Canadian culture, examine the social forces that shape our choices, and perhaps even spark nostalgia for a time when these names were as common as Tim Hortons coffee shops. Each name we explore represents thousands of real Canadians who carried these identities through their lives. From the one-room schoolhouses of rural Saskatchewan to the crowded urban schools of Toronto and Montreal, from the fishing communities of Newfoundland to the logging towns of British Columbia. These were the Dorises and Normans, the Shirleys and Waynes who built modern Canada, even as their names fell out of fashion. So settle in as we open the dusty yearbooks, rifle through old census records, and resurrect the names that once defined Canadian childhood. This isn't just a list, it's a memorial to the identities that shaped our grandparents and great-grandparents, and a meditation on how something as personal as a name can become a historical artifact. Shirley. Let's begin with Shirley, a name that dominated Canadian girls' names through the 1930s and 1940s, but has now virtually vanished from birth announcements. Shirley started as an English surname, meaning bright meadow or bright clearing, derived from the Old English words sheer, meaning bright, and ley, meaning meadow or clearing. It was originally used as a place name in various locations across England. The transition from surname to given name began in the 19th century, but it was a relatively uncommon choice until the 1930s. The explosion of Shirley as a first name can be traced to one person, Shirley Temple, the iconic child star who captured hearts across North America and beyond. Born in 1928, Shirley Temple became the biggest box office draw in Hollywood during the depths of the Great Depression, starring in films like Bright Eyes, Curly Top, and The Little Colonel. Her infectious optimism, remarkable talent, and signature golden ringlets made her a phenomenon. For Canadian parents struggling through the economic hardship of the 1930s, Shirley Temple represented hope, joy, and innocence. The name Shirley suddenly felt magical, associated with this bright, talented child who seemed to embody everything good in a dark time. In Canada, as in the United States, birth registrations for Shirley skyrocketed. In many provinces, it became the #1 or #2 name for girls throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. Canadian Shirleys born during this era grew up during World War II, experienced the post-war boom, and came of age during the cultural transformations of the 1960s. They attended one-room schoolhouses in rural Canada and the expanding urban schools of growing cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. In many classrooms, there might be 3, 4, or even 5 Shirleys, necessitating the use of last initials or middle names to differentiate between them. The name's popularity persisted through the 1940s and into the 1950s, though it began to decline as Shirley Temple's cultural dominance waned and a new generation of stars emerged. By the 1960s, the name was falling out of favor. It had become too common, too associated with the previous generation, and perhaps too connected to a specific cultural moment that no longer resonated with young parents. In Quebec, the name also appeared, though less frequently than in English Canada. French-speaking families sometimes used the spelling Shirley as well, though it competed with traditional French names and wasn't as dominant as it was in English-speaking provinces. Today, Shirley has become what onomatopicians call a grandma name, a name so strongly associated with older generations that young parents avoid it. The data is stark. While thousands of Canadian girls were named Shirley in the 1930s and 1940s, fewer than 20 per year received the name by the 2010s. In a typical modern Canadian elementary school, you'd be hard-pressed to find even one Shirley. But the Shirleys who were born during the name's heyday are still very much with us. Women now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who carry a name that was once the height of fashion but now marks them as belonging to a specific generation. Many of these women have lived remarkable lives, contributing to Canadian society in countless ways. Their now old-fashioned name, a reminder of the dreams their Depression-era parents held for them. Will Shirley ever return? Naming trends are cyclical, and some vintage names do experience revivals. We've seen this with names like Charlotte, Emma, and Jack, which fell out of favor only to return stronger than ever. But Shirley's strong association with a specific celebrity and era may make it harder to revive. For now, it remains a beautiful artifact of Canadian naming history, a reminder of when movie stars could influence millions of naming decisions, and when optimism in dark times took the form of a curly-haired child star. Name number 2. Norman. If Shirley dominated girls' names in the 1930s and 1940s, Norman held a similar position among boys' names for several decades, particularly from the 1920s through the 1950s. Norman has deep historical roots. It literally means Northman, or man from the north, referring to the Norse Vikings who settled in northern France in the early medieval period. The region they controlled became known as Normandy, and the Normans themselves became a powerful force in European history, most famously conquering England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. The name Norman thus carries connotations of strength, conquest, and noble heritage. As a given name, Norman became popular in Britain during the Victorian era's fascination with medieval history and Norman architecture. British immigrants brought the name to Canada, where it found particular favor in the early 20th century. The name appealed to parents who wanted something dignified and strong for their sons, with historical weight but without being too old-fashioned or unusual. Norman peaked in Canadian popularity during the 1920s and 1930s. In some provinces, it ranked in the top 10 boys' names for years. This was an era when British cultural influence remained strong in English Canada, and names with British historical connections were highly valued. Norman fit perfectly. It was dignified, masculine, and carried associations with military prowess and leadership, qualities that resonated with a generation that had just fought in World War I. Canadian Normans of this era grew up during the Depression, fought in World War II, and built families during the post-war boom. They worked in factories, on farms, in offices, and in the resource industries that drove Canadian economic growth. In Quebec, the name was less common but not unknown, sometimes appearing as Normand with French pronunciation and spelling. The name's decline began in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s and beyond. Several factors contributed to this fall. First, as with many traditional names, Norman began to feel old-fashioned as the children who bore the name aged. Young parents of the 1960s and 1970s, shaped by rock music, counterculture, and social revolution, gravitated toward names that felt more modern and less connected to their parents' generation. Additionally, Norman suffered from what linguists call phonetic aging. The sound patterns that once felt strong and dignified began to feel stodgy and dated. The norm sound cluster fell out of fashion, and the name became associated with an older generation. Television characters and pop culture references to Normans tended to depict them as conventional, boring, or square, not traits that appealed to parents wanting to give their children distinctive, dynamic identities. There's also the nickname factor. While Norm can be friendly and approachable, it lacks the energy and style of more contemporary nickname options. Parents choosing names like Alexander could offer Alex or Xander as modern-sounding nicknames. Norman really offered Norm, which increasingly felt dated. By the 1990s and 2000s, Norman had plummeted in popularity. In the 2010s, fewer than 50 Canadian boys per year were named Norman, a decline of over 95% from the name's peak decades. Modern Canadian classrooms might have 20 or 30 boys and not a single Norman among them. Yet the Normans born during the name's peak years remain an important part of Canadian society. Men now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who bear a name that once represented the height of respectability and strength. These Normans witnessed extraordinary change in Canadian society, from the pre-television era through the digital revolution, and their now vintage name serves as a marker of their generation. Will Norman ever return to favor? Some traditionally masculine names have experienced modest revivals as parents seek alternatives to the ultra-popular names of recent decades. Norman has the advantage of being straightforward, easy to pronounce, and carrying historical gravitas. But its strong association with an older generation may keep it in the realm of forgotten names for years to come. For now, Norman remains a monument to an era when British historical names dominated Canadian birth certificates and when parents sought dignity and tradition in their naming choices. Name 3. Doris. Doris represents another quintessentially mid-century name that was once incredibly common in Canadian classrooms but has now virtually disappeared from birth announcements. The name Doris has ancient origins, deriving from the Greek ethnic name Doris, which referred to the Dorians, a Greek tribe. In Greek mythology, Doris was a sea nymph, one of the 3,000 Oceanids who were daughters of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys. She was the wife of Nereus and mother of the 50 Nereids, making her a figure of classical maritime mythology. The name thus carries associations with water, beauty, and ancient Greek culture. As a given name, Doris became popular in English-speaking countries during the late 19th century and early 20th century, part of a broader Victorian and Edwardian fashion for reviving classical Greek and Roman names. Parents were drawn to Doris for its combination of classical sophistication and pleasant sound. The name felt cultured without being pretentious, accessible without being common. In Canada, Doris peaked in popularity during the 1920s and 1930s. It was particularly favored in English-speaking Canada, where it regularly appeared in the top 20 girls' names. Parents choosing Doris for their daughters were often seeking something refined and pretty with cultural depth but contemporary appeal. The name fit perfectly. It had classical roots but felt modern, and its 2 syllables created a pleasing, feminine sound. The popularity of Doris was also boosted by several notable bearers. Doris Day, born Doris Marianne Kappelhoff in 1922, became one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the 1950s and 60s, known for her wholesome image and roles in romantic comedies. Though her stardom came slightly later than the name's peak popularity, she helped maintain Doris as a recognizable and respectable name choice through mid-century. Canadian Dorises born in the 1920s and 1930s came of age during World War II, married during the late 1940s and 1950s, and raised families during the post-war boom. They were the mothers and grandmothers of the baby boom generation, the women who kept households running during the war, who worked in factories and offices, and who navigated the dramatic social changes of the 20th century. In classrooms across Canada, from the small towns of the prairies to the expanding suburbs of Ontario, Doris was a familiar name. It wasn't unusual to have 2 or 3 Dorises in a single classroom, differentiated by last names or middle initials. The name crossed class lines. It was chosen by working-class families and middle-class families alike, making it a truly democratic name of its era. The decline of Doris began in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1970s and 80s. Like many names of its generation, Doris began to feel dated as the women who bore it aged. The name became strongly associated with an older generation, making it less appealing to young parents. The classical associations that had once made it feel sophisticated began to seem old-fashioned rather than timeless. Name 4. Wayne. Wayne represents a particularly interesting case in Canadian naming history, a name that surged to enormous popularity in the mid-20th century, but has now virtually disappeared from birth announcements, despite remaining common as a surname. The name Wayne originated as an English occupational surname, meaning wagon maker or wagon driver, derived from the Old English word wag, meaning wagon or cart. As a surname, Wayne was relatively common in England and later in English-speaking colonies, including Canada. The transition from surname to given name followed a common pattern in English naming traditions, where surnames were adopted as first names, often to honor family connections or simply because parents liked the sound. As a given name, Wayne began appearing with some frequency in the early 20th century, but its explosion in popularity can be traced largely to one figure, John Wayne, the iconic American film actor. Born Marion Robert Morrison in 1907, he adopted the stage name John Wayne in 1930 and went on to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, particularly known for his roles in Western films. His image of rugged masculinity, frontier toughness, and American individualism made Wayne feel like a powerful, masculine name. In Canada, Wayne surged in popularity from the 1930s through the 1960s, reaching peak popularity in the 1950s and early 1960s. During this period, Wayne often ranked in the top 20 or even top 10 boys' names in several Canadian provinces. The name appealed to parents for multiple reasons. It was short and punchy, had a modern sound, carried associations with the rugged individualism of Western films, and felt accessible and down-to-earth, rather than pretentious or overly formal. The popularity of Wayne in Canada was also significantly boosted by Wayne Gretzky, born in 1961, who would become the greatest hockey player in Canadian history. Though Gretzky's influence came slightly later than the name's peak popularity, he helped maintain Wayne as a recognizable and respected name through the 1970s and 1980s. For many Canadians, Wayne became synonymous with hockey excellence, adding a distinctly Canadian dimension to a name that had initially been popularized by American Western films. Canadian Waynes, born during the name's peak decades, grew up during the post-war boom, came of age during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, and built careers during the economic transformations of the late 20th century. They were part of the generation that saw Canada evolve from a resource-based economy toward a more service and technology-oriented one, that witnessed the rise of Canadian nationalism and cultural identity, and that navigated dramatic social changes. In classrooms across Canada during the 1950s and 60s, Wayne was ubiquitous. It wasn't unusual to have multiple Waynes in a single grade, necessitating the use of last names or nicknames to differentiate between them. The name crossed regional boundaries. It was popular in the Maritimes, Ontario, the Prairies, and British Columbia. Even in Quebec, where French names dominated, Wayne appeared with some frequency among English-speaking families. The decline of Wayne began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 90s. Several factors contributed to this fall. First, the cultural reference points that had made Wayne feel powerful and masculine began to seem dated. Western films fell out of fashion, and John Wayne's particular brand of masculinity began to feel old-fashioned or even problematic to younger generations. The name became strongly associated with the previous generation, making it less appealing to new parents. Phonetically, Wayne also faced challenges. The single-syllable straightforward structure that had once felt modern and punchy began to seem plain and uninteresting compared to more elaborate names that were coming into fashion. Parents increasingly sought names with more syllables, more varied sounds, and more distinctive rhythms. Wayne, with its simple, direct sound, felt increasingly ordinary. Additionally, Wayne suffered from what might be called cultural saturation. It had been so popular for so long that it had lost any sense of uniqueness or special quality. Parents wanted their children to have distinctive identities, and naming a son Wayne felt like choosing the most ordinary, unremarkable option possible. Name number 5. Beverly. Beverly represents a name that was once extraordinarily popular for Canadian girls, but has now become exceptionally rare, marking it as one of the most dramatically declined names in Canadian history. The name Beverly originated as an English place name and surname, derived from the Old English words befor, meaning beaver, and lek, meaning stream or clearing. It thus meant beaver stream or near the beaver stream. The place name Beverly or Beverly appears in Yorkshire, England, and the surname Beverly developed from families who lived in or near that location. The transition of Beverly from surname to given name occurred primarily in the early 20th century in North America. What's particularly interesting about Beverly is that it became overwhelmingly popular as a girl's name despite originally being masculine or gender neutral. This pattern reflected broader trends in American and Canadian naming, where place names and surnames were increasingly being adopted as feminine given names. Beverly's surge in popularity occurred primarily from the 1930s through the 1950s. During this period, Beverly often ranked in the top 20 girls' names across Canadian provinces, and in some years and regions, it appeared in the top 10. The name appealed to parents for several reasons. It had a sophisticated, upscale sound. It was modern without being too unusual. It had 3 syllables, creating a pleasant rhythm, and it felt distinctly feminine despite its origin as a place name. The popularity of Beverly was influenced by cultural associations with Beverly Hills, California, which had become synonymous with glamour, wealth, and Hollywood sophistication by the 1920s and 30s. Naming a daughter Beverly created associations with this world of elegance and success, even for families in small Canadian towns far from the glitz of Hollywood. The spelling variations of the name add an interesting dimension. While Beverly became the standard American and Canadian spelling, the original English spelling Beverly also appeared with some frequency. Some Canadian families preferred the lay ending as more properly British, while others chose the more streamlined lie ending as more modern and American. Canadian Beverleys born during the name's peak decades came of age during the 1950s and 1960s, a period of tremendous social and cultural change. They were part of the generation that saw expanded educational and career opportunities for women, that participated in the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, and that navigated shifting expectations about women's roles in society. Many Beverleys pursued higher education and careers at a time when this was becoming more acceptable and common for women. In Canadian classrooms of the 1940s and 1950s, Beverly was a familiar name. It appeared on class rosters from coast to coast, chosen by families across different social classes and regions. The name had a democratic quality. It was sophisticated enough to appeal to middle-class aspirations, but accessible enough to be chosen by working-class families as well. The decline of Beverly began in the 1960s and accelerated dramatically through the 1970s and 1980s. Multiple factors contributed to this steep decline. First, and most obviously, the name became strongly associated with an older generation. As the Beverleys born in the 1930s and 40s aged, the name began to feel like a mom name or even a grandma name, making it unappealing to young parents. Phonetically, Beverly also fell out of fashion. The 3-syllable structure with emphasis on the first syllable began to feel dated compared to newer naming trends. The Bev sound cluster lost its appeal, and the entire name began to feel heavy and old-fashioned. New naming trends favored lighter, more varied sounds, names ending in vowels, names with different stress patterns, names with more contemporary phonetic qualities. The nickname Bev also became a liability rather than an asset. While it had once been a friendly, approachable nickname, it increasingly felt dowdy and unfashionable. Unlike some names where nicknames can be refreshed or varied, Beverly really only offered Bev, which became increasingly dated. Additionally, Beverly suffered from cultural timing. The associations with Beverly Hills that had once made the name feel glamorous began to seem superficial or materialistic, particularly during the countercultural movements of the 1960s and 1970s. The name's aspirational qualities became less appealing as cultural values shifted toward authenticity and away from conventional markers of success. By the 1990s and 2000s, Beverly had become exceptionally rare in Canadian birth announcements. In the 2010s, some provinces reported fewer than 5 girls per year named Beverly, and in some years the name didn't appear at all in certain provincial statistics. This represents one of the most dramatic declines in Canadian naming history. A name that had been in the top 20 had virtually disappeared within 2 generations. Today, Beverly exists primarily in the form of Canadian women now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who bear a name that was once the height of sophistication, but now marks them as belonging to a specific past era. These Beverlys lived through extraordinary changes in women's roles and opportunities, and their now vintage name serves as a marker of the aspirations their mid-century parents held for them. Will Beverly ever experience a revival? The return of vintage names has become a trend in recent years, with names like Charlotte, Eleanor, and Theodore making comebacks. Beverly has some qualities that could appeal to modern parents. It has historical depth, a connection to place, and a certain vintage charm. However, its very strong association with a specific generation and its dated sound patterns make a revival unlikely in the near term. For now, Beverly remains a poignant reminder of mid-century Canadian naming preferences when place names carried aspirational meanings and when Hollywood glamour influenced naming decisions from coast to coast. Name number 6. Gary. Gary stands as one of the most dramatically declined boys' names in Canadian history. A name that dominated mid-century birth certificates but has now virtually vanished from modern naming choices. The origins of Gary as a given name are somewhat complex. While it's often associated with the German name element ger, meaning spear, Gary's rise as an English given name was primarily influenced by the American actor Gary Cooper. Born Frank James Cooper in 1901, he adopted the stage name Gary Cooper in 1925, taking Gary from Gary, Indiana, his agent's hometown. Cooper became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, known for his strong, silent masculinity and roles in Western and action films. Gary Cooper's enormous popularity in the 1930s through 1950s created a surge in the name Gary across North America. For parents of this era, Gary represented modern masculinity, American success, and a certain rugged handsomeness. The name was short, strong, and contemporary. It didn't carry the weight of tradition like names such as William or Henry, but instead felt fresh and of the moment. In Canada, Gary exploded in popularity in the 1940s and peaked in the 1950s and early 1960s. During this period, Gary often ranked in the top 10 boys' names in many Canadian provinces, and in some years, it was the number 1 or number 2 choice. The name's popularity was truly extraordinary. In some Canadian cities during the 1950s, as many as 3 or 4% of all baby boys born in a given year were named Gary. Canadian Garys of this generation grew up during the post-war boom, came of age during the cultural transformations of the 1960s and 1970s, and built careers during the economic changes of the late 20th century. They were part of the baby boom generation, a cohort that shaped Canadian culture, politics, and society in profound ways.
In classrooms across Canada during the 1950s and 1960s, Gary was omnipresent. It wasn't at all unusual for a single classroom to contain 3, 4, or even 5 boys named Gary, necessitating the use of last names, middle initials, or nicknames to differentiate between them. Teachers would have rosters with Gary M., Gary S., and Gary T., all listed in sequence. The name transcended regional boundaries. It was equally popular in Newfoundland and British Columbia, in rural Saskatchewan and urban Ontario. The name even appeared with some frequency in Quebec, though less commonly than in English Canada. English-speaking Quebecers chose Gary at rates similar to other Canadian provinces. And occasionally, French-speaking families would adopt the name as well, attracted by its modern sound and international recognition. The decline of Gary began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s. The fall was steep and unrelenting. Several factors contributed to this dramatic collapse in popularity. First, and most obviously, the name had become oversaturated. Gary had been so popular for so long that it had lost any sense of uniqueness or special quality. Parents wanted their sons to have distinctive identities, and naming a boy Gary felt like choosing the most ordinary, common option possible. Second, as the generation of Garys born in the 1940s and 1950s aged, the name became strongly associated with that specific generation. Young parents of the 1970s and 1980s didn't want to give their babies names that reminded them of their own peers or slightly older generation. Gary became what onomasticians call a dad name, a name so associated with the previous generation that it became impossible to imagine on a baby. Phonetically, Gary also suffered. The simple two-syllable structure with the hard g sound began to feel dated and uninteresting. New naming trends favored more elaborate names, names with softer sounds, names with more varied rhythmic patterns. Gary, with its straightforward, punchy sound, felt increasingly plain and old-fashioned. Additionally, Gary suffered from negative cultural associations that accumulated over time. The name became associated with a certain stereotypical figure, the middle-aged, suburban, somewhat boring everyman. Pop culture references to Gary often depicted characters who were unremarkable, conventional, or comedic figures. This created a feedback loop, where the name became less appealing because of its associations, which in turn reinforced those very associations. The decline was remarkably swift. Gary went from being in the top 10 boys' names in the early 1960s to barely appearing in the top 100 by the 1980s. By the 2000s and 2010s, Gary had plummeted to the point where fewer than 50 Canadian boys per year were given the name, a decline of over 98% from its peak. Today, Gary exists primarily as the name of Canadian men now in their 60s and 70s, a marker of their mid-century birth. For now, Gary remains firmly in the category of forgotten names, unlikely to return to fashion anytime soon.
Name number 7. Linda. Linda represents one of the most popular girls' names of the mid-20th century, achieving a level of dominance that's hard to imagine today, before falling precipitously from favor. The name Linda has multiple possible origins. In Spanish and Portuguese, Linda means beautiful or pretty. In Germanic languages, the element Lind means soft, tender, or flexible, appearing in names like Belinda and Sieglinde. As an independent name, Linda emerged in the English-speaking world in the 19th century, but didn't achieve widespread popularity until the mid-20th century. Linda's explosion in popularity occurred in the 1940s and 1950s, when it became not just popular but absolutely dominant. In the United States, Linda was the #1 girl's name from 1947 to 1952, and in Canada, it achieved similar dominance, regularly appearing in the top 5 throughout the 1940s and 1950s. During peak years, as many as 5% of all baby girls born in some Canadian provinces were named Linda. The name's popularity was influenced by several factors: its international appeal,
recognizable in multiple languages, its pleasant sound, its meaning of beautiful, and cultural influences, including the song Linda, written by Jack Lawrence in 1946. The name felt modern, pretty, and sophisticated without being pretentious. Canadian Lindas born during this peak period grew up during the 1950s and 1960s, came of age during the social revolutions of the late 1960s and 70s, and entered the workforce during a period of expanding opportunities for women. In every Canadian classroom of the 1950s and early 1960s, there would likely be at least one or two Lindas, and often more. The decline of Linda began in the 1960s and accelerated rapidly. The name had become oversaturated, losing its special quality. As the generation of Lindas aged, the name became strongly associated with that cohort, making it unappealing to younger parents. By the 1980s, Linda had fallen out of the top 100 in most provinces, and by the 2010s, fewer than 20 Canadian girls per year were named Linda. Today, Linda remains a mom name or grandma name, carried by women in their 50s through 70s, a reminder of when one name could dominate a generation. Name number 8, Ronald. Ronald was a stalwart boy's name throughout the mid-20th century, popular across Canada before falling dramatically from favor in recent decades. The name Ronald derives from the Old Norse name Ragnvaldr, composed of the elements regin, meaning advice or decision, and valdr, meaning ruler or power. The name came to Scotland with Viking invaders and became anglicized as Ronald. It carries connotations of leadership, wisdom, and strength. Ronald achieved significant popularity in Canada from the 1930s through the 1960s, regularly appearing in the top 20 boys' names. The name appealed to parents for its solid, dignified sound, its Scottish heritage, important in Canada with its strong Scottish immigrant population, and its combination of tradition and accessibility. Notable bearers included Ronald Reagan, who served as California governor and later U.S. president, though his prominence came after the name's peak popularity in Canada. The name Ronald had the advantage of offering multiple nickname options: Ron, Ronnie, or the full formal version, allowing flexibility across different life stages. Canadian Ronalds born during the name's peak decades attended schools throughout the country, from the Maritimes to British Columbia. The name crossed class and regional boundaries, chosen by families seeking something respectable and traditional without being overly formal. The decline began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s. Ronald became strongly associated with older generations, and the name's formal, somewhat stodgy sound fell out of step with contemporary naming trends that favored more casual or unique options. The nicknames Ron and Ronnie also began to feel dated. By the 2000s and 2010s, Ronald had become rare in Canadian birth announcements.
Name 9, Sharon. Sharon stands as one of the most popular girls' names of the 1940s and 1950s, achieving remarkable popularity before virtually disappearing from modern birth certificates. The name Sharon has biblical origins, referring to the fertile plain on the coast of Israel mentioned in the Song of Solomon. "I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys." This biblical reference gave the name both beauty and spiritual significance. Sharon thus means a fertile plain and carries associations with flowers, particularly roses. Sharon surged in popularity in North America during the 1940s and 1950s. In Canada, it regularly appeared in the top 10 girls' names during this period, with particular strength in English-speaking provinces. The name appealed to parents for its combination of biblical gravitas, pleasant sound, and modern feel. It didn't sound too old-fashioned or too unusual. It hit a perfect middle ground of familiarity and freshness. The two-syllable structure with emphasis on the first syllable, Shar-on, created a strong, confident sound that parents found appealing for their daughters. The name also benefited from being easy to pronounce across different languages and regions, making it accessible to diverse Canadian families. Canadian Sharons born during the 1940s and 1950s grew up during the post-war economic boom, experienced the social changes of the 1960s and 70s, and became part of the generation of women who entered the workforce in increasing numbers. In classrooms across Canada during the 1950s and 60s, Sharon was ubiquitous, often appearing multiple times per grade. The decline of Sharon began in the 1960s and accelerated through subsequent decades. The name became strongly associated with the mid-century generation, making it less appealing to younger parents. The phonetic structure that had once sounded fresh began to feel dated, and the name took on associations with an older demographic. By the 1990s and 2000s, Sharon had fallen dramatically in popularity. In the 2010s, fewer than 15 Canadian girls per year were named Sharon in most provinces, a decline of over 98% from its peak. Today, Sharon is firmly a generational marker, identifying women now in their 60s and 70s. Name 10. Dennis/Denis. Dennis, or Denis in its French form, was a remarkably popular boy's name in mid-20th century Canada, particularly notable for its cross-cultural appeal in both English and French-speaking regions. The name derives from Dionysius, the Greek god of wine and revelry, through the Latin Dionysius to the French Denis and English Denis. Saint Denis became the patron saint of France, making the name particularly significant in French Catholic culture. The name thus carries both classical and Christian significance. Dennis achieved substantial popularity in English Canada from the 1940s through the 1960s, regularly ranking in the top 30 boys' names. In Quebec and among French-Canadian populations, Denis with one N was even more popular, often appearing in the top 20 names for boys. This cross-linguistic popularity made Dennis/Denis one of the few names that bridged Canada's English-French divide. The name appealed to English-speaking families for its friendly, accessible sound and its classical roots. For French-speaking families, Denis connected to their Catholic heritage and the patron saint of France, maintaining cultural and religious significance while sounding contemporary. Canadian Denises and Denises born during this period grew up in a Canada that was defining its bicultural identity, navigating English-French relations, and experiencing rapid social change. The name appealed in schools throughout the country, pronounced slightly differently depending on the linguistic community, but recognizable across both cultures. The decline began in the 1970s and continued steadily through subsequent decades. Both Dennis and Denis fell out of fashion as naming trends shifted toward more unique choices and away from the common names of the previous generation. The Den sound cluster began to feel dated, and the name took on associations with an older demographic. By the 2010s, fewer than 40 Canadian boys per year were named Dennis or Denis combined, a dramatic decline from when hundreds received the name annually. Today, Dennis/Denis identifies men primarily in their 50s through 70s, representing an era when this classic name dominated Canadian classrooms on both sides of the linguistic divide.